or more stable, whatever you want to call it. And then do you ever have those moments where you stop and say, wait a minute, where's God in all this? Am I just leaving God out there in a tent? The day when I read this verse, I'm just reading along, and I read this verse, and all of a sudden I say, whoa, that's me. The beauty of that moment for David, and the beauty of that moment for us when we have that moment of realization, if we do have that moment of realization, it's a moment of tenderness. It's a moment of gaining perspective, a divine perspective on what's going on. It's a moment of humility. We get so wrapped up in our own lives that we get pride easily takes control. This is a moment of humility, saying, wait a minute, oh, I forgot, it's not about me, is it? There's a beauty in that moment, and it reveals a beauty of heart. David may have been a murderer. David may have been an adulterer. David may have been a man of blood. He was a crappy father. He did a whole lot of lousy stuff, didn't he? But the thing is, somehow the Bible still refers to him as a man after God's own heart. How can that be? The chronicler wants us to see it. It can be. It can be because of moments like this. It can be because there was something about David's heart that set him apart. Kind of like Josiah, right? When he read the book of the law, he didn't have to read it. He didn't have to pay attention. He didn't have to do anything about it. But when he read it, his heart was responsive. When David had this moment of recognizing I'm spending all this effort on me and I'm leaving God out in a tent, it was a moment of eyes opening. It was a moment of tenderness of heart. By the way, read David's Psalms. These are more moments of tenderness of heart that reveal something beautiful inside a man, something responsive to the touch of God, something that shares a degree of intimacy, a degree of love for God's embrace that is very, very powerful. And I think it's little things like this, when you put all the pieces together, that capture the heart of the books of Chronicles. And I think, as to put it kind of sort of in a nutshell, what does God want? Tenderness of heart, worship and joy, and he wants the devotion of his children. Ultimately, humans are going to have a real hard time being consistent in these respects, and there seems to be an honesty about that. But ultimately, God understands that, and that's why he has promised the one to come, right? Who will be the anointed one and who will make things right in a way that we can only just begin to imagine by looking at an idealized David. Now, I've been cheating. This whole time I've been cheating. We've been ignoring the prophets. How can we ignore the prophets? Well, we're ignoring the prophets in part because you're doing them next week. So I'll leave that to you. But we can't ignore the prophets entirely, can we? So let's go back to the prophets and spend a little time. Just a little time. Oh, by the way, when you do these things, tenderness of God, worship and joy, devotion, something happens. Isn't that great? It's a Jew party. Yeah! And by the way, one thing the Jews really have figured out, and it is a shame on us Christians that we have lost it to a large degree, Jews understand that worship of God is to be joyful. Jews really understand the nature of celebration before God. And I have a colleague who's a Jew, and he is just fascinating. He's got this capacity to capture this joyfulness, the celebrative nature of Judaism, and because of this, lots and lots of people who are, from all different religious points of view have really come to appreciate Judaism. And he has, we have a Passover Seder at our school, and 500 people come because it's just joyous, it's just fun, it's just this a playful time. Jews, the whole not ceremonial, but the whole festival system, the great 7 festivals of the Hebrews and so on, are meant to capture this sense of joy. So this is actually quite a nice quite a nice picture of the celebratory nature of Judaism. And really the book of Chronicles is quite celebratory, isn't it? God wants us to have a party. Have a party. That's a good thing in honor of God. Okay, now to the prophets. We'll leave our Jew in midair. I want to spend a little bit of time reflecting on two of the great prophets that you primarily hear about in the books of Kings, Elijah and Elisha. We need a scripture reading first. So who will read for me? 1 Kings 18, 21 to 39. 1 Kings 18, 21. You got it? All right, go for it. 1 Kings 18, 21 to 39.
21:39?
Mm-hmm.
Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go living between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I, even I, only am left a prophet of the Lord. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves and cut it in pieces and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood and put no fire to it. You call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people answered, "It is well spoken." Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose for yourselves 1 bull and prepare it first, for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it." And they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, perhaps he is asleep, and must be awakened." And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out upon them. And at midday passed their day on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came near to him, and he prepared the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he made a trench about the altar as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order and cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water and pour it out on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time," and he did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time," and he did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. And at the time of the offering of oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, that you have turned their hearts back." Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God."
I know. Isn't that a great story? One of the great stories. This is Elijah in a nutshell. You might have heard the story of the businessman who went to a trip in Florida. When he arrived, he wrote an email back to his wife, but maybe you've had this experience. He missed the email address by 1 letter, but it ended up being a real email address. Instead, his email went to an elderly woman whose husband had just passed away. The email said this: "It was a long and difficult trip, but I finally arrived. Accommodations not as nice as expected. Looking forward to your arrival tomorrow. By the way, it's awfully hot down here. Your loving husband." Sometimes things aren't what they seem, are they? This is certainly the case for Elijah and also for Elisha. So let's spend a little bit of time looking at Elijah and trying to come to terms with this great prophet. Now you remember Ahab. So much of the ministry of Elijah is going on during the time of Ahab, the fourth king of Israel. Remember that he was the one who pulled together that alliance that defeated Shalmaneser III at the Battle of Karkar. It was he who fortified cities and added the water systems at Megiddo and Chatzor. He was an able diplomat. He fought Assyria to a standstill. In all these ways, Ahab was an outstanding king, except for one big problem, which of course is central to the Bible, and that is that Ahab and Jezebel rejected the God of Israel and worshipped instead Baals. Here, Elijah enters our story. The very first time we see him, 1 Kings 17, Elijah comes out of nowhere on the scene, and the very first thing he does is he rebukes the king. And he declares a drought. There will be no rain except at his command. This is typical Elijah. Always the upfront guy, always associating with the who's who. If you look in your New Testament, Elijah appears 29 times in the New Testament. 29 times. In fact, he is one of the most prominent Old Testament figures to appear in the New Testament. Some thought Jesus was Elijah returned, which shows the memory was alive after nearly 900 years. Jesus said that John the Baptist was a new Elijah. Elijah appeared with Jesus and Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration, if you remember. When you look at the record of Elijah in the Old Testament and just do a quick litany of things that are recorded about him, it's really quite remarkable. He was fed by God via ravens. He raised a widow's dead son. He engaged in this great Mount Carmel showdown we just read about against the prophets of Baal. Wouldn't it be nice if we could all do that? He prophesied before Ahab that rain would return, and it did. At his word, he caused Ahab to repent before him. He prophesied disaster upon Ahab and Jezebel, and it came true. Ahab had been able to stand against the great Assyrian Empire, but he could not stand before Elijah. Elijah prophesied disaster on the next king, Ahaziah. Ahaziah sent armies to take Elijah out, and Elijah called down fire from heaven and fried the army. He then took off his mantle, dipped it in the Jordan River, and parted the Jordan River. When he got to the other side, a chariot of fire came from heaven and took him up without death. Somehow, that was appropriate. We would expect such an ending after such a life for Elijah. In sum, Elijah was a giant, a great man of God, always at the center of the action. When we turn to Elisha, we get a very different picture. The very first thing we hear about Elisha is God told Elijah to choose him as his successor. So Elijah went looking for him and found Elisha plowing his family fields. How appropriate. Elijah begins with a bang, confronting a king. Elisha begins in humility, plodding behind a pair of oxen. Upon Elijah's call, however, Elisha left his plow mid-furrow, kissed his parents goodbye, sacrificed the oxen to God, which I'm not sure his parents appreciated, and followed the great prophet to become his servant. Much of Elisha's life was spent serving the basic needs of his great mentor and living in his shadow. Elijah showed up 29 times in the New Testament. Elisha, once. Nevertheless, some remarkable things Elisha did. The very first scene, you get a picture of it. It's rather funny when you think of it. So, Elisha and Elijah go across the River Jordan after he's part of the River Jordan with his mantle, remember? They get across the other side. Chariot of fire comes down, swoops up Elijah. Elisha is left standing there, and here comes floating down the mantle of Elijah that he's just used to part the Jordan River. Can you picture Elisha? Goes picks it up, puts it on. He goes over to the waters of the Jordan River. Right? Dip it in the Jordan River just to see if it'll work. And the Jordan River parts! He goes, this is going to be cool, man. This is cool. This is good. I just think it's a rather funny picture that you get. So his very first thing is that he parts the river. He then, when he gets across the river, he goes to Jericho. Jericho has a poisoned well. He cleanses the water at Jericho. He also provided water for Israel's army when they were stranded in Moab. He provided oil for a poor widow so she would not lose her sons to slave traders. He raised a widow's son, the one parallel with Elijah. He purified a poisoned stew. He fed 100 people with 20 loaves. He healed a Syrian military captain of leprosy. He retrieved an iron axe head that had been dropped in a river. And he blinded some Aramean warriors who attacked Israel. Very interesting resume. Only once in all of his ministry did Elisha ever speak to a king. It was King Joram of Israel, and the king had to ask who he was. The answer he got? Oh, Elisha? That's the guy who poured water on the hands of the great Elijah. That's his reputation. Elisha was a no-name prophet whose only claim to fame was his association with the great man he had served. And when it came time for Elisha's death, he was buried in a grave like any other man. Elisha's was a ministry without fireworks. No hobnobbing with the rich and powerful. No confrontation with the king and queen. No incendiary encounter with the prophets of Baal. No clear influence on the major powers of the day. No chariot of fire to carry him to heaven. No fame. One paltry reference to him in the New Testament. And nobody ever made the mistake of thinking that John the Baptist or Jesus was a new Elisha. We might say, from our human perspective, that Elisha was a loser. Never first, always second, always overshadowed by his great master. Why, we might even conclude that Elisha was a peon of a prophet, a little person. And in saying so, I think we would miss the point altogether. Yes, Elijah's ministry was more flashy and public, but that does not mean it was more important. Elisha's ministry was quieter, more private, but it was of eternal importance. All his life, he must have been aware of Elijah's greater prominence, but there's no evidence that it bothered him. God had given him a different job description and a different set of gifts. Different, but not less important. Just ask those who drank the purified waters at Jericho. Just ask the woman whose child was resuscitated. Just ask the widow whose children were saved from slavery. Just ask the people who ate the formerly poisoned stew, or the Syrian captain who was cured of leprosy, or the man who borrowed an axe only to drop its head in a river. All of them would tell you just how unimportant was the ministry of Elisha, that peon prophet. They, and perhaps many others, would give thanks to God that Elisha, at least, was not too busy dealing with the high and the mighty to reach out to their humble needs. Another scripture reading, this from the New Testament, Mark chapter 15, verses 40 and 41. I quote, this is the scene was the crucifixion in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is being crucified. And this is the scene at the foot of the cross. There were also women there, looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James, and Salome. These used to follow Jesus and provided for him when he was in Galilee. What a fascinating little verse. These 4 women. We know a lot about Jesus and his 12 apostles and all they did, but did you ever wonder how they made ends meet? Did you ever wonder how their work was financed? You ever wonder how they got food or water or had places to stay or clothes to wear? There were many other disciples besides the 12, though they get little press. Here, we get a precious glimpse. The answer to all those questions, to a large degree, was those 4 women. Their ministry was even humbler than that of Elisha. But it was absolutely essential. Make no mistake, Jesus' ministry would have been impossible without them. These 3 women may get little press, but they are not little people. The New Testament teaches that we all have spiritual gifts, given by God to be used for His kingdom. Some of you may have the gifts of an Elijah, the prophet who stands in the center of the action. But most, perhaps all of us, will not. Elijahs are exceedingly rare. Others of us may have gifts that equip us for a ministry more like Elisha, quieter, more private. Still others of us may find ourselves more like Mary and Salome, blessed with the gifts of helps or mercy. One of the crucial truths of the Bible is there are no greater or lesser gifts, no greater or lesser people. Every gift is essential. Every person has a vital ministry to provide. You might have remembered the storm that happened last winter along the Oregon coast. A huge storm came up, and one of the results was massive numbers of starfish got washed off of their moorings and washed up onto the beach. And as the tide receded, you just had thousands of starfish out there shriveling up. One young man walked out on the beach, started picking up starfish and throwing them back in the water. A cynical onlooker called out to the young man, "You can't possibly make a difference in this tragedy. Look how many there are." The young man smiled, picked up another starfish, threw it in the water, and he said, "Well, made a difference to that one." The great biblical truth is this: we can make a difference. There are no little people. For each of us as Christians, the important thing is that there are some people, whether great or small, who can be thankful that we have lived and that God has worked through us. Amen? Amen. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for everyone in this room. Lord, for the gifts that you have given in this room, some of which may not even have been revealed yet. How different we are, and yet how rich because of what you have given us. Lord, I thank you for every person in this room, and I ask with trust that you will give them wisdom to discern what their gifts are and how you would call them to use them. And Lord, that you would use them to do great things, things that I could never do, places that I could never go, with people I will never meet. But nevertheless, your kingdom will be blessed through every person in this room. Amen. We are done.
Can we ask questions?
You may ask questions, yes.
Yes. So,
Let me pass the mic around for the question time.
Wow, I'm early.
It's okay.
Check it out.
It's Friday. You're becoming more beloved,
so my question may need some imagination to answer. I remember Phil Leach, when he was teaching us, he said Israel was never meant to be an empire. God strategically put them in this place so that they can live a life, a paradigm that honors God. So, but Israel has never been able to do that. In this past week, when you were teaching, I see as if a vivid picture of a spiritual power shifting. When the judges were not able to follow God, Israel was really poor in leadership. Out of the whole nation, God's Spirit came to one, but he was not even able to live a decent life for himself, let alone for the nation. But then, not many years later, one young man had a resolve to honor God in the wilderness, tending sheep, or on his flight, trying to avoid of assassination or killing. He left alone, but his resolve somehow invited a heavenly power. And then later on, he trained so many leaders out of a bunch of hooligans, bad guys. And then his nation, when I was reading First Chronicles, I was so impressed by the fact that under David's leadership, Israel was so rich in leadership, in so many leaders, military leaders, worship leaders, and tribal leaders, so many leaders. But then the table was turned when it was Solomon's time. Through your explanation, I felt the power shifted again. When David was inviting heavenly power, Solomon laid down that power by associating with these alliances around him. He developed the nation into a big empire, but that's when the real power, he lost the real power. So I was imagining if Israel ever lived a life that honored God. One point you mentioned was the weakest entity can be one that acts alone. But I was thinking, if Israel lived a life that honors God, they will be alone. So how can that influence be transpired? How can they associate with the neighboring nations? And how this world history will be rewritten?
Oh, wow. Now, in that last question, are you talking about modern Israel, or are you talking about ancient Israel, or what are you talking about?
Ancient Israel, when they
Ancient
went
Israel. Well, the chronicler seems to be saying that the monarchical system has been and probably will be unsuccessful in doing that. And so not only an empire, but even the idea that Israel as a political entity would be godly, that seems to be ill-conceived. That ultimately the people of Israel individually and corporately need to be transformed. So I think that for them to fulfill the image of being the people through whom all nations are blessed, right, Abraham's promise, in order to do that, the people need to be transformed as a whole. And the chronicler is suggesting, follow the example of the good David, follow the leadership of the Levites. That's your best shot at going there. As we will see, that won't work very well either. Maybe it's better in certain ways, but there's going to be problems with that as well. So I think it's a perennial challenge, which is why I think the idea of the Messiah is starting to grow now in the Chronicles, and you're going to start to see this in the prophets and so on. The idea that a normally constituted monarchy, as Israel has had, it keeps running into problems. The realities of human existence keep running into problems. It's going to require God's intervention to fix that. And that intervention is going to require transformation of the people, a spiritual transformation of the people. So I think we're moving from what the Hebrews viewed as really a political strategy, and we're moving more into a transformational strategy. That the people need to be transformed. And because the people need to be transformed, it's going to require God's intervention to do that. So it's bigger than the nation by far. And now, of course, I'm coming from a Christian point of view. So from a Christian point of view, I can say, well, and Christ came, and he came to bring about that transformation, and he's been doing it ever since. And that's how it looks. So I guess while I try to read the Old Testament not looking at it from the New Testament perspective, but trying to read it in its own context, here's a place where I kind of find that irresistible, right? That you're really not going to find an answer in the post-exilic Hebrew community. And they are going to recognize that answer isn't there. That's why they start talking more and more about the need for a Messiah.
Another question?
Could I say in northern Israel, a prophet take a role of priest? Because though there is a priest in northern Israel, but they are just not real priest. So, in the view of God, maybe the prophet take the role of the priest. That's my question.
In the north, in particular.
Yeah.
That makes some sense. Of course, you have it also in the south where you have priests. But you will have examples, plenty of examples of corrupted priests. But you're right. In the north, the priests, if you remember in Chronicles, in the north, the priests, Jeroboam sets up his own priesthood. So the Levites in the north, they kind of have nothing to do. So they tend to come to the south. So the functioning priests in the north for Jeroboam's temples, they're kind of representatives of the corruption, the sin of Jeroboam. And so because of that, many of the prophets will be in the north, and I think they will kind of take that role. You're going to have prophets in the south too, though, so bear that in mind. And prophets, as you will see, the role of the prophet, most fundamentally, the role of the prophet is to speak into the community of Israel and call them back to God. Very often it's negative. They'll say, here's what you're doing wrong, and you need to stop doing what's wrong to come back to God. And it's contextual. It depends on where they are spatially and so on. But I think you're right. I think in the north, you do, the priest really does, the prophet really does take over that function.
So if is there any connection with the school of prophet the Elijah made?
The what?
The school of prophet. There was a school of the prophet.
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. Yeah, there are references a couple of times to schools of prophets, but I don't know what the connection is. There's also references to false prophets, like court prophets that are around a king. So there's the true prophets and the false prophets going on too. And of course you're going to be spending a lot of time on prophets here, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. But that's I think there probably is a connection. I just don't know what it is.
I think the School of Prophets were the early DBS template that we've grown under.
I was curious about the tribes, or like the kingdom of Judah, and like what tribes it was, because Simeon is like in the middle of Judah, but I also know that part of Benjamin is and it says 2 tribes and 10, and that was all split.
Right. If you read your Hebrew Bible carefully, you will find that the answer to that question is a little bit inconsistent. It's always the tribe of Judah. Usually Benjamin is included in that, and not unusually Levi, because of the temple function, right? And they're the tribe without the inheritance or whatever. So then you got 3, but they usually don't count Levi. So Judah and Benjamin are most commonly the 2. But then there are people who came from the north who are, grew up in the tribe of Simeon or Manasseh or something, and they come down, and there's even a whole contingent in the army that's from Simeon, for example. So it's not clean. It's not a clean, but mainly you can say Judah and Benjamin. That's the most common configuration that they talk about. Don't forget, when we're talking about 12 and 2, don't forget the 2 half tribes of Joseph. That's right, Ephraim and Manasseh. So that gives you 13. So you get an extra one to work with.
Other questions?
I have a question. It more regards the golden nuggets that you presented in the end here. And I know you had that on the last DBS as well. And the things that you were talking about, Elijah and Elisha. And you also have something that you presented regards the woman at the well there, and the sheep, and how you do that. Do you have that in a book or whatever? Is that some collection that this is really interesting stuff that you're having? And that's it's just a sermon kind of thing I wrote. It's kind of Is that, have you published that somewhere?
No.
Oh, should you do that maybe?
Can I do that?
Can you do it?
Publish my sermon.
It's very good actually.
I would be glad to give you my notes.
Yeah.
You can make some sense out of my notes. You can't make a lot of sense out of them. I mean, because it's just kind of outline form. But you're welcome to do that. But no, you were the one who asked me the question last night, right, about that. Yeah, I've never published that kind of stuff before. I wouldn't even know how to go about it. But so sometimes, usually those things are in most of my notes for all these things are what you see on the PowerPoint, right? So I don't tend to work from very many notes. What I just did on Elijah and Elisha, I do have it on 4. So I have 4 pages of notes for that. I'm glad to give them to you if you would like. And I think I have something similar on the woman at the well.
Maybe we can just take a picture and put them on Dropbox, or do you have it saved in your computer, or is it just a printout?
I might have them in my computer, I don't know. But you're welcome to any of this. In fact,
there's going to be a mad dash.
Because those are so valuable, especially the last DBS and this one.
you even get my joke.
Yeah, perfect. Then we'll take a copy. I can scan the news. Then I'll give an encouragement because this is very valuable wisdom and knowledge that you're presenting. And it's not very often that we hear this kind of summary that gives so much interesting thoughts that is hard to get these days.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so Arnstein will get that on Dropbox. Either take pictures of the notes or type them in there. We'll get them on Dropbox for the rest of the students.
And Arnstein, feel free to shoot me an email, and I can find for you the notes on the. What were you asking about the woman at the well?
Sumerian woman at the well and the sheep. You remember that sheep story that you had last?
How dumb sheep. Dumb
sheep. Yeah.
I was talking about me, you know. Okay, I can give you what I've got.
Yeah.
So I'm glad. So hopefully it's enough that you could fill in and make sense out of it. I hope.
Sure.
That's right. Here, have some. No, you can't have these.
We've got a couple more questions. I've got one real quick. The 2 golden calves that were set up in the north.
Yeah.
There's no reference to size, and I've heard someone give an opinion commentary that they may have only been 1 or 2 feet tall. That for some reason I envision these large, like in front of P.F. Chang's horses, these huge, monstrosities that the people could look at and be, kind of like amazed, and in awe of. But the idea of it only being, like a foot tall or something really was disappointing to me to think of it that way. What is your take on what the actual golden calves were that were worshipped in the north?
Well, let me disappoint you further. The only ones that have been found, there was a group of them found at Ashkelon.
Oh. That just destroys.
Sorry to mess with you, man. No, but that's all we know. We do have some, like in Greece, they had cult statues like you're talking about. So in the temple, the Parthenon in Athens in 5th century BC, you had the great golden and ivory statue of Athena that sat 40 feet tall. That's what you really want.
Yeah.
And that's really cool, but I don't know of anything like that in the ancient Near East. Now, we did see the one stela of the Baal. He's about that big, carved in that stela. But when it's out of gold, I think it's small.
How big was the one they made at Mount Sinai?
I have no idea.
Because they collected all the gold, like earrings from everybody.
Yeah, gold earrings from a bunch of slaves. It must have been about that tall. I don't know. Yeah. And they threw it in the fire. Remember Aaron? He says, I just threw it in the fire. Look what came out. Yeah.
If there is a difference or one and the same, in your opinion, what's worse, the idolatry of the Old Testament or the legalism of the Pharisees and the circumcision party of the New Testament?
Oh, what's worse? I really go with James on this, that what's worse is not something we can ever measure. It's really a matter of I would only view those things in terms of consequences, right? That is, what are the long-term consequences? And I think we have to be a little bit careful. If I were going to be here when you're doing the New Testament, we would talk about Pharisees more. I think they're largely misunderstood. And I think we need to understand precisely the ways in which Jesus differed with them. For the most part, Jesus agrees with them. But he did differ in certain ways, and the ways in which he differed were very important. And it's important to look at that. But I would actually argue that the legalism of many Christians is far more poisonous than the legalism of the Pharisees. To the extent, I mean, we already talked about this a little bit, but to the extent that Christians treat their faith as a bunch of rules to be followed, largely those rules are cultural and not spiritual. And we're imposing our culture on other people, and we're actually creating lots of obstacles to faith. And to me, that's far more harmful than the particular Pharisaic version of legalism, which was actually fairly sensible. Their idea was, we don't want to break the law, so how do we keep a distance from breaking the law? So instead of breaking the law by saying God's name in vain, let's just not say God's name. Well, that's not going to harm anybody not to say God's name. You know what I mean? Whereas the particular forms that certain Christian legalisms have taken, I feel like, cause us to really miss the point and substitute God's love and compassion for judgment and arrogance. And that to me is the consequences of that are so hurtful and so drive people away from the faith instead of drawing them to it, that I feel like that's, in my own opinion. Now, you might note that this is sort of my nature, I suppose, to be somewhat introspective about such things, and to be maybe more critical of my own traditions than those of others, because to the extent that I'm critical of others, I'm not paying, get the log in my own eye, and I'm trying to, I'd rather deal with the log in my own eye.
All right. Another question, Aaron, do you have?
Yeah, a couple times in Chronicles, it said it's the same that we see, I think, in Kings and Samuel to this day. Is that where they copied Kings? Because it's obviously, if it was written where we think it's written, it was definitely not to this day. It's things that weren't to this day. So was that just an exact copy, and if it was, why wouldn't they change that? I was wondering about that.
The only way you can ever answer that question is in context. So the first way to answer that question is this copying Kings? So what's the source? If you have the source in Kings or Samuel or something, and you have it to this day, then it may just be slavish copying, in which case then you'd actually look to Kings to try to look in the context and try to figure out, okay, what day actually is being talked about here? And sometimes you can figure that out. Sometimes it's pretty unclear. Because a lot of times the to this day is the day of the source that the later editor is using. So you've got the event, the to this day, which is later, and then the time of the writer, which is later yet. And it's hard to figure out sometimes which one it is. So you always have to look at it in context and also in terms of sources. It's the only way to get in. If you do that, maybe about a third of the time you can figure it out. The rest of the time you still can't. At least I haven't been able to figure it out.
Any other questions before we begin our... Yep.
As a historian and a Christian, what do you think about the age of the earth and creation?
You like those little questions, huh?
2 minutes.
Age of the earth and creation. Well, okay, creation is easy. God did it. And really all Christians say that ultimately. All Jews say that. All Muslims say that, right? I mean, ultimately, we believe that God created. Then there's this question of when, and there's another question of how. There is a very, very big spectrum of Christian thought on those questions. So all Christians agree that God created. They don't necessarily agree upon when, and they don't necessarily agree upon how. And so you get all the way, my wife is a biology teacher. So we've had lots and lots of conversations about these things, and I could spend a lot of time talking about evidence, historical and biological and all kinds of things to try to sort these things out. So one extreme, so you kind of have the spectrum of Christian belief. So let's be clear, this is all Christian belief here, okay? And there's this spectrum of Christian belief on the when and the how. One extreme of the Christian belief is what you would call young earth 6 24-hour day creationism, okay? So that means that this follows Bishop Ussher's chronology. Bishop Ussher came up with this chronology that said that the earth was created in 4004 BC. The earth was created in 4004 BC in 6 24-hour days. Boom. That's young earth 6 24-hour day creationism. The other end of the spectrum is God created a long time ago, and we're not really sure when, and we're not really sure how. We're leaving that to the scientists. And it appears that one of the major mechanisms of the development of that creation over time is natural selection, but it could be other things as well. Okay, so that's, and this far extreme basically would agree with a secular evolutionist in terms of the when and how to a large degree, but not the who, right? God created, God chose to create a long time ago to have this long process of evolution take place via primarily the mechanism of natural selection, although that mechanism, while everybody agrees with that mechanism, there's also some other mechanisms that people are talking about these days. And then in between, there's all kinds of perspectives. And some people say, well, it's older than 4004 BC, but it's younger than 4 billion or whatever. And, you're kind of in between there somewhere. Some people say, well, I think that natural selection can explain this much, but not this much. I think God had to directly intervene to create humanity, for example, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of positions in between there. And my wife and I spend a lot of time sort of walking around within that continuum, exploring different perspectives and different opinions, and what does the evidence look like, and all that sort of thing. But I do want to make it clear that Christians, Jews, Muslims insist that God created, and everybody, and this is interesting because nobody likes to talk this way. Everybody agrees that natural selection happens. So even these guys, even the 24-hour day young earth creationists agree that natural selection happens. But they only think it happens on a very limited scale. There's a classic example, for example, of the moths of Manchester. So Manchester, England, there's this particular kind of moth, and sometimes it's white and sometimes it's black. Well, the Industrial Revolution started, they had lots of coal smoke going on, everything kind of gets black, so what happens? The white moths get eaten, because you can see them very easily. The black moths reproduce. So what happens to the whole population of moths? White ones go away and you have black moths. That's natural selection. Nobody anywhere that I've ever heard of says that doesn't happen. That's natural selection. So, and natural selection is at the very heart of evolution. So I would make the argument that all Christians are creationists and all Christians are evolutionists. They all agree that natural selection happens. They all agree that God created. The only difference, and it's a big difference, is how much can natural selection explain? How much difference can can it explain moving from fish to amphibians, for example? Can natural selection explain that, or can it not? People disagree on that. Can you turn, amphibians into mammals by natural selection alone? Will explain that or not? Can natural selection explain that or not? And you'll get differences of opinion on that. Can natural selection explain the Cambrian explosion? That's actually really, really hard. This drives biologists nuts because the Cambrian explosion is really, really difficult to explain. If you don't know, the Cambrian explosion, we have a Canadian. Who's our Canadian? All right, Canadian. Where in Canada are you from? Ontario, wrong side. Well, anyhow. What? BC. All right, you're from the right side. There you go. So, you know Yoho. Yoho National Park, up there in the Rockies. Okay, up at the top of Yoho is one of the greatest pieces of evidence in the world. It's called the Burgess Shale. The Burgess Shale is this extraordinary formation of rock that was under the ocean and has been, you know, uplifted into the Rockies, but it was under the ocean, and it was something happened underwater, and a bunch of critters got buried, and they were held in a non-oxygenated condition for a long period of time when they were buried underwater, and the result is they were perfectly preserved. So you get this great preservation, and these creatures are some of the oldest in the world. So what you have is, at the bottom of the Burgess Shale, all you have is bacteria, single-celled animals. And then right on top of them, no gap, right on top of them is this extraordinary collection of sea life. All kinds of different body types. In fact, more body types than exist in the world today. A lot more. All of a sudden, out of nowhere. Explain that. Explain that by natural selection in particular. That really, you know, because this is the single best piece of evidence we have of early life on this earth. How do you explain going from single-cell animals to these extraordinary rich diversity of body types, including the first vertebrate, by the way? Wow, that's very impressive. And so scholars argue about this stuff, right? And how do you make this jump? This is the basis for, in evolutionary circles, what's called punctuated equilibrium, if you're familiar with that theory. So that's just one example of many where you look at something and you say, wow, that's hard for natural selection to explain that. So how much can I really get my mind around that I think natural selection can explain this, and how much can it not explain, and where would I draw the lines, and et cetera. To me, that's the big question, and it's an interesting question, and it's a question that can be honestly had. That is, people can sit down and say, well, how would you explain this, and how would this work, or whatever. Unfortunately, people are too busy pitching camps and saying, I'm here and I'm against you, and I'm here and I'm against you, and you have even this whole anti-evolution literature, which by and large doesn't understand evolution. And then you have this anti-Christian literature from atheistic scientific points of view, and you get this just horrible mess that has been created by these debates that I think never should have happened. I think there's good debates to be had. How much can natural selection explain? There's a really good debate to be had by there. I have a friend, by the way, who's a former student of mine who's now a professor of biology down at San Diego State. And he's made a really interesting discovery that genes are not stable. Like, you have a pair of identical twins, and they're both in a situation where people are starving to death, there's not very much food, and they'll get exactly the same amount of food, and one will survive and the other. Now, they're genetically identical, one will survive and the other one won't, and when you check their genes, remember, identical twins have identical genes. When you check their genes and trying to figure out why did one survive and the other one didn't, their genes aren't the same. They've changed. How does this happen? Well, it happens because of viruses. Viruses change genes. And so actually, so that's another mechanism. That's not natural selection. Natural selection is about things reproducing and things getting killed off and changing a gene pool. But this is changing the genes in an individual in a way that they can be passed on. Viruses do that. So now that's a whole different field of biology where my former student is kind of a pioneer, and really cool stuff is coming out. And so I just think, I mean, you know me enough by now to know I'm hopelessly curious. You know, I'm just interested in stuff. I'm interested in exploring stuff, and I'm not interested in picking fights. I'm interested in learning the truth to the extent that I can, and I actually have quite a bit of background in biology, so I can a fair amount, and when I can't, I ask my wife. Or my former students who are way smarter than me. So I feel like, so to answer your question, I don't know. I think we need to be, if we are going to follow the truth. We want to follow the truth of the Bible, and we want to follow the truth, any other truth that we have, and we try to put them together in the most thoughtful way we can, and we pay attention to the literary genre of the text and the original intent of the author and all that kind of stuff that you're doing here. And because of that, we realize right away that, for example, Genesis is not written as a scientific textbook, so we shouldn't treat it as such, right? That's one place where people get stuck. We say the Bible is true, but true in what sense? Let's be clear. That's to be determined by the intent of the original author and the genre and all those kinds of things. And on the other hand, science is always in process. It's not like science has final truth or whatever. If you know anything about how science works, you always are tentative about that. And you always want to see replication. You want to see evidence and the nature of experiments and all that kind of stuff. And to me, that's just interesting. To me, it's fun to explore that stuff, and I don't feel like I need to set up a camp and say, I've got it right, and you've got it wrong, and you've got it wrong, and you're going to hell if you don't agree with me.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah. Great.
So
that was beyond 2 minutes, but still very good. Very good.
You started touching on it. I think it'll be a good follow-up after. Could you speak to biblical inerrancy and kind of in the same way you did here, and the nature of the Bible itself?
Oh gosh.
The nature of how we. This is just, we say it's true, we say it's inspired, we say it's all these things, but are we missing actually the point of what it is and how God wants to use it among His people when we have these arguments? 2 minutes.
I think that DBS is doing it right. They're approaching the question in the way I think it most responsibly should be. We assume as Christians that the Bible is inspired. We assume that there is to be discovered in its pages the truth of God. That's where we start. So I think we can say the Bible's true, the Bible's inspired, but the obvious question is, in what sense? And the only way you're ever going to get there is careful study in context, looking for the author's original intent for the original audience and the original language and the original context. And I think that's the right way to do it. If we impose other words on it, we are imposing something that's modern and foreign to the questions we're asking. So I get uncomfortable with theological terms other than those I've used being imposed and saying it has to fit this model the way for example, here's just an example. I have a friend, actually a colleague of my wife's. He teaches chemistry. Smart guy. He teaches chemistry. And I heard him give a presentation one time, and it was on this is actually from 1 Kings, the temple furniture. Remember the temple furniture? And there was the sea. Remember the sea, that great big bowl? Bronze bowl? Yeah. And it gives measurements for the sea. And it gives this measurement of the diameter and the circumference of the sea. I don't know if you noticed that. Who would notice that? And it so happened that it says that the circumference was 3 times the diameter. Well, this friend of mine who's a chemist said, it can't be. Don't you know about pi? Yeah, it has to be 3.1514159, right? It's not 3, it's 3 point something. Bible must be wrong. Must be an error. And so he spent a half-hour presentation trying to recalculate the math so he could get pi in there to prove that the Bible is true. That seems silly to me.
Yeah, it does.
That seemed like this is. What's the original intent of the original author here? Is he really trying to help you calculate pi?
Yeah.
That just seems misguided. I don't mean to insult my friend, but I felt like that's actually missing the point that you guys get when you dig in and try to. So I think that's the best way to find the truth in the Bible, is to think in terms of the questions that you're asking in DBS. I think you're doing it just right. If you weren't, I would tell you so. But so is that? I know I'm being a little bit evasive, but I think the only honest answer is to be a little bit evasive, because it's not helpful to start jockeying modern theological